Question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Call Moana Mackie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I want to start off by saying that there is much in this bill that is very, very commendable. There are also some things which do concern the Labour Party. So if I can start off on the positive, there's a lot in here which streamlines a system which I think will provide a lot more certainty for everyone involved in the process, whether that be industry or whether that be those members of the community who want to have a say in mining projects that are going ahead, particularly in the exclusive economic zone, which is where often a lot of the public concern is around, where a lot of the contention exists. And I think one of the things we're going to need to look very seriously at Select Committee is whether this piece of legislation does address a number of the concerns that were raised when the exclusive economic zone legislation was going through the Local Government and Environment Select Committee. As the Minister well knows, there are many, many pieces of legislation that sit on top of each other, all governing the same activity, all for different reasons, and it's a matter of making sure that nothing falls through the cracks between those pieces of legislation. Not only do we have this Crown Minerals legislation, which issues the permits which allows for the exploitation of the resources, we have the exclusive economic zone legislation just recently passed into law, which monitors and attempts to mitigate the environmental impacts of any economic activity that occurs in the exclusive economic zone, including but not restricted to oil and gas exploration and mining. We have health and safety legislation, we have biosecurity legislation, we have maritime legislation, which is triggered in the event of anything going wrong. And it's for the Select Committee to determine whether or not this piece of legislation is going to adequately compensate for the exclusive economic zone legislation. Because when we were at Select Committee on that bill, a lot of what we heard was, well, you don't need to worry about this because it will be picked up in the Crown Minerals Amendment Bill. And certainly I know I've had discussions with the Minister, and it appears that a lot of those have been picked up, and it will be a matter of going through it far more carefully at Select Committee. Can I say one other thing, that I'm very appreciative that this piece of legislation is getting a decent time at Select Committee. Unlike the previous one which I mentioned, it really is important on these very technical, process-driven bills that we get the time to go through and see what that looks like. We also have more of an idea now what the regulations are going to look like for the exclusive economic zone legislation, which we didn't have when that particular piece of primary legislation was going through. So we're in a far better informed place to make decisions around this. The introduction of a two-tier system certainly seems sensible, as does the idea of pre-vetting applicants, so that those who simply are never going to make it through are told up front as early as possible not to bother. And hopefully that may allay the concerns of some of the people who are worried about what I think you can probably accurately call the lowest common denominator operators, that maybe at the very first hurdle they will be told no, don't bother, and then we won't go through a very expensive and lengthy process of RMA consents and consents under this legislation, where community organisations, where members of the community, where environmental groups spend a lot of their time and money opposing permits which we're probably never realistically going to get through in the first place. Where our concerns lie, again, around the division of control of the conservation estate. And we weren't sure if that was going to be in this piece of legislation. It's unfortunate that it is, because that has been a big issue. The Minister of Conservation is rightly the person who should have the say on concessions on the DOC estate. A lot of the criticism actually of the treatment of mining on conservation land thus far has been that it does get an easier ride than, for example, tourist activities that go through the process under the Conservation Act, whereas mining goes through this process under this particular piece of legislation, which doesn't involve community consultation. And the government did promise that community consultation would happen for concessions for mining on DOC land. I note it goes part way in this piece of legislation. The Minister of Energy and the Minister of Conservation have joint responsibility for deciding whether or not it goes to public consultation. That's not quite what was promised. What was promised was that these things, just like any tourism operation that wants to get a concession on DOC land, that mining would also have to go through a similar process where the public could have their...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for me to leave the chair. This debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day. The House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.